Hi, I'm Karen, and this is the Mental Health Hope You're Not Alone podcast. This space is all about breaking the stigma of mental health, where we'll share personal stories, helpful online resources, and meaningful insights, all with one goal in mind: to remind you that you are not alone in your mental health journey. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Mental Health Hope You're Not Alone podcast. And this is going to be the part 2 of the depression episode that we put out a couple weeks ago, mainly just talking about depression, stories of depression. And today's episode, we're going to talk about what to do with depression and maybe how to handle it, talking to a counselor and how to start those conversations, along with just general things that you can do to help with your depression. First, I'd like to note, if you can take a look, I changed out my picture and it'll look great. I've got two, one that says Mental Health Hope and the other one says You're Not Alone. And so just that, I thought today's episode would be really great, highlighting that you're not alone. That so many people out there are suffering from depression. So what better way than to, number one, listen to podcasts like this, but also to having a sign that says so, that we're not alone. The first thing we'll be talking about is just patient education in general about depression. We did talk a little bit about this before with the definition of depression, but I wanted to bring up some things that were highlighted in this article that I have here. It's about depression within adults. And I know that younger folks, children and so on, have depression as well, but this will be focusing mainly on adults. And so one of the things that I wanted to point out here was that says depression is most common psychiatric disorder worldwide. In the United States, nearly 20% of the population experiences a bout of clinical depression at some point in their lifetime. Even so, many people who have the disorder don't discuss their symptoms with healthcare providers, which we are going to talk about that later in this episode. Instead, 2/3 of the people with depression who see a healthcare provider for routine care come in with other symptoms such as a headache, back problems, or chronic pain. And if you want to know more about my story, go ahead and look. I will link my previous different episodes from before, one talking about anxiety and another one talking about depression, just to let you know that with my story, what got me to the doctor was physical symptoms. It was anxiety initially, where I was dealing with feeling really nauseous for a few days, and finally went to the doctor and was diagnosed with anxiety. So difficulty breeding of depression is one reason that clinicians routinely screen all people for depression. People are reluctant to discuss their depression symptoms for a number of reasons. Often they're concerned about the stigma of mental health. And again, we'll be talking about that later in this episode. And some people may think that it is not appropriate to discuss depression with their healthcare provider. Others may see the condition as a personal weakness rather than a real illness. And some are worried about the implications of a psychiatric illness entered into their permanent record. But effective treatments do exist, and not treating depression can lead to serious problems. People untreated with depression have a lower quality of life, higher risk of unaliving themselves, and higher rates of death than those without depression. So anyway, that is a good segue into what we are going to be talking about next, which is ways to talk to your therapist. Because I know a lot of people, there's this huge stigma about talking with a therapist, and maybe there's some shame with it, or maybe people feel like they don't want to go in and talk about themselves for an hour because they don't want to put in the time, or they just are uncomfortable talking about themselves. I have an article here that is talking about 18 deep conversation starters that you can use to start your conversation with your therapist. And so we're just going to quickly go through these. I do see a counselor every 2 weeks, and I actually am going to start seeing a psychiatrist here coming up towards the end of February to help me with my medication, mainly because my anxiety has been really awful lately, and I'm trying to figure out what I need to do next medication-wise with that. So anyway, back to this list. With this here, the deep conversations with your therapist, it says, I'll just read a little bit and then we'll go into the list. So it says, want to know a secret ingredient for feeling less awkward and more outgoing at a pretty much any social gathering? No, it's not alcohol. Ideally, you want to prompt and question that are simultaneously safe, bet, and also interesting. So it says, before we get started in these suggestions, here's one bonus pro tip that several of our experts offered. Be prepared to share answers to these deep conversation starters yourself, or even go first. People generally respond better when you lead with just little self-disclosure up front. So number one, it says here, what were some of your favorite memories from the year? And then you just start discussing the things that you really enjoy. Does your family have any fun or meaningful traditions? And you can talk about what those traditions are. And I will say, now that I'm in my 50s, I don't see my family as often as I used to. But one favorite tradition that we used to have when I was younger was we used to go to the lake and spend 1 week there with my family and another family. And it was a lot of fun. I have the best memories going there. And I loved being able to do that. And I wish that I still lived in that state so I could go do that occasionally just for old time's sake. Anyway, I digress. What's one of the things that you've overcome that you really feel proud of? What's something you've recommended to friends recently, like a book, a recipe, or a show? What's the worst holiday present that you've ever received? I'll tell you what, I got a regift years ago, probably 15, maybe even 20 years ago, from a family member, and it was a collage photo frame that had several different places for photos, and I actually did use it, but I could tell that it was regifted, which is fine. No judgment. It was just the first time that I'd ever been given a regift. Anyway, again, I digress. What's bringing you joy lately? What's something that you've learned that has surprised you? What movie never fails to make you cry? I'll tell you what, I have two favorite movies. And one of my favorite movies is Indecent Proposal with Demi Moore, however you want to say it. There's a scene in there where the husband and wife are talking to each other, and he's really pissed off because of her cheating on him. And that's the whole premise for the movie. And you just have to see it. If you haven't seen it, you have to see it. But the movie, I think, was back in 1990 or something. It's been a long time. But anyway, and he gets really pissed off at her, and she just starts sobbing because of how upset he is, and that he eventually walks out of the house and leaves and goes to a friend's house, and she's left there sobbing. And I so much relate to that scene, not necessarily somebody walking away, but her reaction to somebody walking away and her uncontrollable sobbing, because I've been there. And I'm sure we all have, but I tend to, because of my history, I tend to not show my emotions anymore. I'm trying to get over that, which this podcast is helping, because if you've followed so far, there have been times where I have cried, which really is uncomfortable for me. But nonetheless, that scene just really seems to, like, I don't know. I love it. I love the scene. It's weird that I like a scene that she's crying, but I love it. Anyway, again, I digress, but this is fun. I want to go through these just so you maybe can have a better idea of who I am. So, even though that's really not the point here today, these are really conversation starters to have with your therapist. So, again, went off on a tangent. So, what do you do? So, anyway, I did have two that make me cry, and the other one that makes me cry, of course, is Beaches. If you've seen that. Actually, Beaches is another one, in Steel Magnolias. Gosh, I'm bringing up some old movies from the 80s. Both are very good. Anyway, okay, so how have I been feeling? Another question. What is one thing that changed your mind about this year? What niche hobbies, interests are you really into these days? What's something you're really proud of that isn't work related? What are you hopeful for about the next year? If money and time were not a factor, what passion would you pursue? What is the last thing that made you laugh? And I'll tell you right now, I have a really good friend my BFF, if you will, and she calls me every day, almost every day, on her way home from work. And she just, we talk about our days, and it's always a fun conversation. So I just got off the phone with her about, I don't know, an hour ago or so, and great conversation as usual. Tell me about a meaningful or surreal experience that you will never forget. Tell me about a high or low from your day or week. Which fictional character do you think you get along with in real life? And so that's 18 things. 18 things that are recommended for you to talk about with your counselor, just to break the ice and get the conversation going. Because I really think a therapist in general, that whole relationship with a therapist is one that it can be hard to find. You have to be able to develop a more close knit relationship with that person. And you may not find that right off the bat. And so it's okay to move from one counselor or therapist to another until you find one that fits you, your personality, your needs, and things like that. So keep that in mind. That I know a lot of times people don't want to question people of authority, meaning doctors and maybe even therapists. But if you're not comfortable talking with somebody about the most personal things in your life, go find somebody that you can have that kind of conversation. So it's really important, because the more open you are, the more honest you are with that person, the better off you'll be and how they'll be able to help you more. So the next thing is breaking the stigma. We all know that depression has a huge stigma around it. And for the longest time, I remained quiet about what was going on, but I had to start telling people, because like my close friends know, but I had to start telling people at work because of the situation that I am in at work. I had to disclose why. And I probably didn't have to. But again, for me anyways, it goes back to those relationships and putting that trust into the people that you are close with. And so for me, that means I wanted to be able to tell my boss that what I was going through. And to be honest, knowing what I know now and having been through what I know, that I would much rather them know than not know, because if they don't know what you're going through, they don't know why things are happening, like why you need to stay at home or why you react a certain way about things, or it just brings a whole new level of interaction between you and your coworkers or your boss. So that's just my opinion. Some people won't say a word and just say, I'm having trouble and I'm going to stay home, whatever, in telework, as an example. So it's just me. I tend to wear my heart on my sleeve. I tend to be really open with respect to things that are going on. And so I tend to tell people that may not be what you want to do. Anyway, so let's talk about this next article. We'll talk about the stigma with respect to mental health and discrimination and prejudice. And we all know that there's a huge stigma around mental health. And a lot of people will judge you for having mental health issues or problems. And that's probably why a lot of people don't say anything, because they don't want somebody to know that they're suffering, because they know that person will judge them one way or another for whatever reason. And I'll give an example. I am now 100% telework, and that's a whole other story, but I fear that people are judging me for not being in the office. It does affect my work in a sense that maybe there are times where I will call in sick, or it affects my work because I am distracted or very anxious. It may take me longer to get tasks done, but I'm very worried about what people think of me because of not being in the office. So there's a whole thing with respect to stigma. It says more than half the people with mental illness don't receive help for their disorders. We just mentioned that in the previous article, or 2 articles ago now. Often people avoid and delay seeking treatment due to concerns about being treated differently and fears of losing their jobs or livelihoods. That's because stigma, prejudice, and discrimination against people with mental illness are still very much a problem. Stigma, prejudice, and discrimination against people with mental illness can be subtle or obvious, but no matter the magnitude, they can lead to harm. People with mental health are marginalized and discriminated against in various ways, but understanding what that looks like and how to address and eradicate it can help. So let's talk about that. This article here has three different types of stigmas that they've identified. So one is public stigma, self stigma, and structural stigma. And we'll go through each one of those. And so public stigma involves the negative or discriminatory attitude that others may have about mental illness. Self stigma refers to the negative attitudes, including internalized shame, that people with mental illness may have about their own condition. And then the structural stigma is more systematic, involving policies of government and private organizations that intentionally or unintentionally limit opportunities for people with mental illness. So, for example, it says include lower funding for mental illness research and fewer mental health services relative to other healthcare. So basically, it's saying that it's more systematic. It's more within the system that things are being discriminated against. Stigma not only directly affects individuals with mental illness, but it also affects loved ones who support them, often including their family members. Stigma around mental illness, especially an issue in some diverse racial and ethnic communities, it can be a major barrier to people from those cultures accessing mental health services. So, for example, in some Asian cultures, seeking professional help for mental illness may be counter to cultural values and strong family, emotional restraint, and avoiding shame. Among some groups, including the African American communities, distrust of the mental health care system can also be a barrier for seeking help. So that's real interesting. I'm going to take a really quick sidestep. About a year ago, I went through school and got a master's degree in communications. And one of the really cool projects that I did in that degree was having to understand the different types of communication around the globe and how the cultures are so different and how communication is different. And I did communication comparisons between the United States, Germany, and China, thinking that Germany and China were going to be more alike than the United States. And boy, was I wrong. The United States and Germany were more alike, and China was the outlier. And that just goes to show what I know about foreign countries. But it was real interesting to see how the cultures between those three different countries were with respect to communication. And it was really interesting to learn that. I never would have guessed that. So again, I digress. So let's move on. Another part here is talking about the types of stigma. And again, it's public, self, and structural. So stereotypes and prejudice, it says public, people with mental illness are dangerous, incompetent, to blame for their disorder, and unpredictable. That's public. Self, I am dangerous, incompetent, and to blame. Structural, stereotypes are embodied in laws and other institutions. So that was stereotypes and prejudice. And so the next one here is discrimination, again, with public, self, and structural. And so with discrimination, the public is employers may not hire them, landlords may not rent to them, and the healthcare system may offer lower standard of care. For self, these thoughts may lead to lower self-esteem, self-efficacy. Why try? It's put in quotes, why try? Someone like me is not worthy or unable to work, live independently, or have good health. And then the structural leads to intended and unintended loss of opportunity. That's pretty interesting. All right, harmful effects of stigma. So stigma and discrimination can contribute to worsening symptoms and reduce likelihood of getting treatment. And it talks about effects can include reduced hope, lower self-esteem, increased psychiatric symptoms, and difficulties of social relationships, reduced likelihood of staying with treatment, and more difficulties at work. Stigma can also impact family and friends may often provide essential help and support for the people with mental illness, but can also experience stigma. They may internalize stigma and blame themselves, or they may fear that people will blame them for causing a loved one's illness or reject the family socially. The stigma can lead to reduced emotional support, social isolation, and reluctance to seek care for their relatives. Interesting. Stigmas for the workplace. This is my biggest fear. Stigmas for the workplace. But a poll in 2022 from the American Psychiatric Association found that mental health stigma is still a major challenge in the workplace. About half of workers say they discuss mental health openly and honestly with their supervisor, down to 56% in 2021. That's interesting to know that it's gone down. I will say this, and I don't want to get all political, but prior to this current administration, mental health was looked at in a different light, in that you could be more open and honest about it. And it was being more widely accepted. And a lot of the things that have occurred over the last year or so is starting to show that it's not as openly accepted as it used to be. However, I will say that my office actually does offer mental health first aid, and we're going to be talking about that moving forward. I haven't decided what episode it's going to be, but we'll be talking about mental health first aid and how that is and how that works with respect to people that you know, and how to see when somebody is struggling, and then give you ideas on what you can do about it. So we will be talking about that in a future episode. So anyway, reducing the stigma, public health approaches. Many years of research of anti-stigma interventions has found that successful interventions include contact, so in person. Sometimes video can be helpful, but if done right, but usually being in person is better. Focus on a range of disorders, not just depression or mental illness broadly. Involve participation of people with lived experience, which is what this whole podcast is about, discussing ideas and experiences with mental illness, especially depression. The whole goal is that to not feel alone, and talking about that and having participation is really important. Target groups that have the most interaction or where lack of help seeking is most problematic, and tailored to be credible, specific language, culture signifiers of target group, which is so important. Not every culture around the world approaches mental health the same way. So there's not going to be a one-stop shop for everybody that's dealing with mental health. Every person is different. Every person has a different story. Everybody approaches mental health in a different way based on who they are as a person. And that may be because of who they are growing up. And I hate to say it because I know it's such a dirty word, but that's exactly what diversity is. Diversity is differences within people and their culture, how they were brought up, and their experiences in their life. Diversity is not a dirty word. All right, individual actions to help reduce stigma. And here's the big thing. This is really exciting because that's the whole point, right? We want to talk about what stigma is, but how do we help to reduce it? Ultimately, that is the goal. And I personally think, and this is number one here on the list, I personally think that talking about it is the number one way to get rid of stigma. Because right now there's such a taboo with it that people whisper behind each other's backs, oh, so and whatever. And that's not the way to do that. Talk about it and get to understand and know it. That's what's really important. So it says here, the National Alliance of Mental Health offers some suggestions on what we can do as individuals to help the stigma of mental illness. This is so huge. So what's the number one? Talk openly. Let's talk openly. Educate yourself and others. Respond to misconceptions and negative comments by sharing facts and experiences. This is exactly today's episode. Be conscious of language. Remind people that words matter, and they do matter. Especially with respect to mental illness. Do you want to say mental illness? Do you want to say mental issue? I honestly don't know what to say because I fear I'm going to offend somebody. But with that said, I also feel that telling somebody the wrong thing because maybe you don't believe them really could be bothersome to some people. And we actually will talk about that later in an episode, especially with anxiety of what not to say to somebody. That's huge. So anyway, show compassion for those with mental illness. Absolutely. Be honest about treatment. Normalize mental health treatment, just like other healthcare treatment. And let the media know that when you are stigmatizing language, presenting stories of mental illness in a stigmatizing way, I think that's big too. There was a video that I was watching recently about, this is totally off subject. It has absolutely nothing to do with mental health. But I was watching a video recently and it was about a woman who, I don't remember what happened to her. But the commentator, the person that was talking about her story, every time they introduced her, they said something about how she had two children from two separate husbands. And I was like, who the freak cares? What matters is that her story matters, not the fact that she has two children from two different husbands. Who cares? How does that really affect this story in any way? It doesn't. It's ridiculous. And so it's things like that. Now, I know that has absolutely nothing to do with mental illness, but it's things like that. Why bring it up if it doesn't matter? Is that just to add some drama to the story? I just don't see the point. All right. Anyway, again, I digress. So anyway, choose empowerment over shame. I fight stigma. This is in quotes here. I fight stigma by choosing to live an empowered life. To me, that means owning my life and my story, refusing to allow others to dictate how I view myself or how I feel about myself. And that quote came from Val Fletcher. Okay, now this last part here is talking about employers who are leading efforts to address stigma. Offer some suggestions. Tailor programs, approaches to your company's culture and existing strengths. Mention your commitment to leading a behavioral healthy workplace. Train leaders to identify emotional distress and make referrals. Be welcoming of the need for accommodations and train managers to respond appropriately. I think that's huge. When I initially started talking to my boss about my mental health struggles, and I don't think she meant it this way, but it came out awful. So I initially requested to telework 100%. And basically I get to go in whenever I want, but I tend to telework 100% of the time. And when I initially put in that request, my boss's response was, we all have to go into work. You can deal with this too, or something along those lines. I don't really think she meant it that way because the conversations that we've had since then have been really empathetic and kind. And so I may have just caught her off guard with the initial request, but it's so much easier to talk to your boss or your supervisor if they are sympathetic to your situation. If they are not, it makes it harder to, number one, be in that situation, but it also makes it hard to discuss that situation with your boss. Really hard to discuss that. So keep that in mind, supervisors out there. If you're thinking about how you want to be as a supervisor, be one that understands that your employees are human and they have human emotions, and depression and anxiety can be a part of that. All right, next up, again, we're still talking about stigma here, but next up on the list is, and I think this is going to overlap with what we were doing before. This other article here says 7 strategies to help fight mental health stigma. I think this is huge. Educate yourself and others. I think that's big. And I think, honestly, just with most anything, that most people do not learn anything about something, whether it be cancer, mental health, some type of health issue in general. They tend to not learn about it until it happens to either themselves or somebody they know. And I don't fault you for that. I can't see somebody spending a Friday night learning about cancer unless somebody in their family is dealing with cancer. So I understand that. And so I would expect, honestly, the folks that will be listening to this podcast and these episodes are not people who actually need to listen to it. It's going to be people who are dealing with a mental health issue more so than those maybe of family members. Unless maybe the family member now has someone in their family that is dealing with the mental health and maybe they're trying to find out more. Joe Smith next door who doesn't have either a family or aren't maybe not be dealing with themselves is not going to sit at home on a Friday night and learn about mental illness. They're just not. So it's going to be hard to educate those folks. But anyway, so it says here, one of the best ways to fight mental health stigma is through education. Learn about mental health conditions, their causes, symptoms, and treatments. Share this information with others to increase understanding and empathy. Correct myths and misconceptions whenever you hear them. Educating yourself and others is an effective way to break the stigma and promote mental health awareness. Totally agree with that. Totally agree with that. And I think that's one of the reasons why I've talked a little bit about it more at work. It's uncomfortable because of the stigma, but I want people to know that I can come in happy, smiling, and still be struggling. And so I think I have said in past episodes where I was told I was faking it, and that's because I am really good at hiding everything. And I'm trying to not do that now necessarily. I won't say I'm high. It's hard to say. So what I'm saying is that I won't show people that I'm depressed at work, but I'll tell them that I am, which is hard because they'll be like, you don't act like it. How do you act like you're depressed? For me, I don't go out of my house very often, but that's a whole other episode. Anyway, so this next one here on the list is speak out against the stigma. Have the courage to speak out against the stigma and mental health stigma when you see it. Challenge negative attitudes and stereotypes, call out offensive language, and share your own experiences or those of others who have struggled with mental health challenges. And speaking out against stigma can be uncomfortable, but it is important to stand up for what is right and to support those who are the most vulnerable. And I agree with this. So I actually am adopted, but my mom deals with bipolar disorder. And she was originally diagnosed with that in 1985. And she's had episodes periodically throughout her time on this earth. And I do actually want to do another episode about that, talking about bipolar and my experience with a family member who has it. And because everybody's experience is different. But nonetheless, it's interesting to learn and understand about other types of mental health. Like for me, I'm dealing with depression. My mom's dealing with bipolar. There's a whole array of different types of mental health out there. And so the more we talk about it and discuss it and educate others, hopefully that will reduce the stigma. But this is going to be quite the mountain to climb because the stigma is quite huge. So anyway, support those who are struggling. Number 3 here on the list is support those who are struggling. If someone you know is struggling with their mental health, offer support and understanding, listen to their concerns, and validate their experiences. I would totally agree with that. And when I talk to somebody about my mental health, I'm absolutely not looking for suggestions on what to do. I don't care what your opinion is about what you think I need to do with respect to my mental health. That's not your place to tell me. It's not anyone's place to tell me. The only person that I would take recommendations for is my counselor. I say that in a stern voice because, listen up, men. Men tend to feel that their job is to offer advice and ways to help. And that's not at all, at least coming from a woman's perspective, that is not what we're wanting to do when we talk to you about our mental health. All we want you to do is listen. At least that's my experience. Maybe there's somebody out there that wants somebody to tell them what to do. But with respect to my experience, I don't want you to tell me what to do. Number one, I don't like being told what to do. But second of all, That's what I have a counselor for. And now I have a psychiatrist. So it's not your place. Anywho, let's move on. Use respectful language. The words we use can have a powerful impact on others. Be mindful of the language and use when talking about mental health. Avoid using derogatory terms or labels that can be hurtful or stigmatizing. Instead, use person first, I think it's first person language that emphasizes the individual rather than the diagnosis. So, for example, say a person with bipolar disorder instead of a bipolar person. Okay. Challenge stereotypes in the media. We just talked about that. I gave you my example. The next one here is advocate for change. And advocacy is a powerful tool in fighting mental health stigma. Contact your elected officials if you want to participate in advocacy events and campaigns to raise awareness and promote change. Join mental health organizations and support their efforts. And actually, I think this is something I want to do. I don't want to overdo it on things that I want to do because I do struggle to get out of the house, but I do want to try and maybe start doing some volunteer work with respect to mental health, but we will see. There are things that I'm trying to do to get myself out of the house, and one of which is join a choir locally. I haven't gone yet because I just haven't done it, but I did reach out to them. And then I am going to try and get involved in a community activity that I have going on in my neighborhood. And then at some point, I'd like to maybe get back into swimming. And so joining a swim team was one thing. And then this other thing is doing the volunteer for mental health. So we will see. I don't have any professional experience in that, so I don't even know if I could do that. But it's something on my mind. So anyway, the last thing here on the list is take care of your own mental health. It says, finally, taking care of your own mental health is essential in fighting mental health stigma. Prioritize self-care activities that promote mental health and emotional well-being. Seek support from friends and family or a mental health professional when needed. Taking care of your own mental health not only benefits you, but it sets an example for others and helps to reduce the stigma. It helps reduce by promoting a culture of self-care and compassion. And I agree with that. I'm not the best at doing that, but I am trying to get better. For example, I am, like I said, I'm trying to get involved in all these activities, but also too, I am trying to work out more often. And if you've been following this podcast for a while now, which I don't think I have many followers, but if you're following out there, thank you. But if you're out there following, I have woken up the last 3 days and walked. I didn't walk outside because it's snowy, but I did get on my treadmill and walk for a few minutes. And I'm going to try and do that as often as I can. I'm actually thinking about trying to do it every day for the month of February. We will see. No expectations. The other thing that I mentioned way back when was my Be Normal campaign, and I wanted to give an update on that. So it's very hit and miss. Like, I didn't have any expectations, but I want to try and be as normal as I can. And part of that is bringing things that I used to love before this big problem here I have with anxiety and depression, is bringing that into my current life, which swimming is one of them, choir is another. And so things like that. I want to be able to try and find some happiness that way. And working out, of course, is another one. So everything, I'm trying to just make sure that everything is happening in a way that's comfortable. Like, I don't want to overdo it. Thank you so much for joining me today on today's episode of Mental Health Hope You're Not Alone, and where we discussed depression, mainly in adults. We talked about 18 different ways to start a conversation with your therapist. And then we had 2 different articles, or very similar articles, I will say, about ways to break the stigma with respect to mental health. And I will link those below so you can check them out yourself. But I also wanted to talk about what our next episode is going to be. We're going to take a deeper dive into stigma and shame that comes with that. Come back in 2 weeks and we will be talking a little deeper dive into the shame and stigma of what you can do with respect to depression. So I'll see you later. Thanks.